Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of Not History but News. Now this week we are looking at the news review from the 12th of October 1939, which is a few days after Hitler has made a speech. He made a speech on the 6th of October, shortly after he'd finished conquering Poland, basically calling for peace in Europe and suggesting a peace conference. But everybody's really sceptical about that, and it's that and the tone of that scepticism is really the main theme of this week's paper. So in the behind the headlines section, it says that Hitler is in the thick of a Machiavellian scheme for wangling peace with honour out of the democracies. It says innocent assistants in this Machiavellian plan are those who say that as Poland has disappeared, the war should be stopped before Europe is drenched in blood. That's exactly what Hitler wants. He would like Neville Chamberlain's postbag in Downing Street to be full of such letters. Hitler has always thought that the British people are spineless, decadent and unwilling to fight, and so has von Ribbentrop. Their entire policy is moulded on this assumption. The Chamberlain government, however, requires guarantees that if the war machine is halted, there will be no more Nazi aggression in Europe. Mere promises are not guarantees. The restoration of Poland and Czechoslovakia would have to be full and complete. And apparently Hitler's trying to fight a Boer war. Obviously a bit of a pun on the Boer War, but what it's basically saying is he's thinking that if he can achieve a stalemate on the Western Front, then he keeps arguing for peace, then eventually a peace movement will arise within Britain. So they basically don't believe that Hitler is really committed to peace, and they think that ending hostilities now would just be a pause before he started again. It says that Hitler has already learned one lesson from the war, the importance of control of the seas, and that it would suit him to call a truce now so that he could start building a monster German navy. And here it's suggesting that the Germans lack the resources for a long, drawn-out struggle. And it's suggesting that both Stalin and Mussolini are losing faith in the Nazis. It says the two men who at this moment are best able to judge Germany's chances of victory, Stalin and Mussolini, have shown unmistakably that they do not think much of those chances. Stalin's grip on the Baltic and the Balkans is as clear an indication as could be desired of his belief that Hitler will be in no position after the war to reward Russia for its cooperation. And Mussolini's insistence on Italian neutrality and his refusal to act as Hitler's stooge in hawking the German peace plan around Europe shows that he does not fear the Führer. So there's an article here that's suggesting frustrations and fallings out within the Nazi party. It says that Hitler is now fighting on two fronts. He's fighting along the Siegfried Zone, but he's also fighting within his own party. Many of its lieutenants view the Führer's sale of the Baltic and the Balkans to Stalin as an act of betrayal. But Hess has been loyally trying to silence these Nazi outbursts. After all, says Hess, wasn't the Führer the seventh member of the German Workers' Party? So he's kind of saying that Hitler's background was in socialism, and that he would prefer to see Germany become part of the Soviet Union than see it surrendered to the Western democracies. And it's also pointing out that Hitler can be seen wearing a revolver. It says he fears assassination. But Adolf Hitler's worst fear is that having risked so much for Russian support, Big Joe Stalin will let him down. The Nazis may be reconciled to the idea of losing the Baltic countries as possible colonies, but they cannot view without grave misgivings the establishment of Soviet naval bases in the Baltic. It is this move on Stalin's part which has revealed to informed observers the deep-seated distrust which exists between the Nazis and Russia. And then we have history in the making, which again is a kind of a summary, a day-by-day summary of the main things that are happening. But most of this week is just about the conquering of Poland and then Hitler's proposal for peace. So it says on Wednesday, the 4th of October, Foreign Secretary Halifax says Britain's answer to the possible offer by Germany of an uneasy and uncertain armistice is no. And then on Friday, Hitler lays his peace demands before the Reichstag, Point 1, an international conference. Point 2, return of Germany's colonies. Point 3, disarmament. And point 4, economic discussions. Then on Saturday, October the 7th, answering Hitler's peace offer, the British government statement says it will be carefully examined, but comments that no peace proposals will be acceptable which do not free Europe from aggression. So a really strong commitment here from the British to be tough on Hitler and to be clear with him that the only way hostilities are going to end is if he pulls out of Poland and restores Poland and Czechoslovakia. On Monday, October the 9th, Hitler clears out all Germans from Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, as Stalin marches in his troops. And on the West Front, the populations of all German villages and towns to a depth of 15 miles on the Rhine's bank are to be evacuated. So this paper is clearly presenting Hitler's peace proposal as a bluff, and it's very obviously working hard to make sure that its readers see the proposal as a bluff. It's slightly strange the way they've approached it. I'm kind of detecting a pretty heavy layer of sarcasm in this next article, God's Bone. It says, a god spoke from the Reichstag rostrum in Berlin one day last week. The drums of war were rolling. The cities of Poland were splashed with blood. 86 million German people were mobilised for a lonely struggle against the combined might of Britain and France. Then God got up from his seat, his hand uplifted in a Nazi salute, and talked of peace. The deity of Nazi Germany was bluffing again. And then the rest of the article just kind of talks about how Hitler was a bluffer. As a schoolboy, he showed off by smoking cigarette stubs collected from the gutters. And then there's talk about manoeuvres that he did in the First World War, where he relied on bluff. And it's again a bit of a character assassination of him, really. By propaganda, the Führer has bluffed the German people into proclaiming him the instrument of divine providence. Because of that, and only partly because he has a weak stomach, he lives the simple life, eats no meat or fish, and drinks no wine. To foster the impression that his only love is Germany, he avoids feminine company, but for several years he has paid the rent on the Munich flat, occupied by his buxom friend Eva Braun, aged 28. And then the paper's continuing to promote the idea that Hitler's just being tactical. It says, for some time Hitler stood gloating over the destruction of Warsaw and over the endless queues of Polish citizens who were, in inverted commas, generously presented, according to a Nazi commentator, with a glass of water and a piece of bread by the German army. It says next day the man who, inverted commas, refused to make war on women and children hurried back. The time had once more come for a pause of digestion and to prepare the diplomatic field for the next victim. So in other words, he's conquered Poland, he then wants to take a pause, he wants to argue for peace before deciding on his next conquest, is what they're suggesting. It says the need for speed, however, was not so much because of the quickening tempo of his successive conquests, but because Britain and France had presented themselves in the roles of international policemen, and the Führer was a wanted man. Accustomed for too long to having his will implicitly obeyed inside Germany, Adolf Hitler evidently believed he could get rid of these police. It was still possible to start a war and stop it when convenient. All that was necessary was to point out that the victim was responsible for the crime and had paid the penalty. Then the police would admit that the victim was indeed dead and unable to come to life again, and would go away sheepishly, scratching their heads over their error. In Berlin, the warmonger coolly demanded a peace on these lines. His speech to the world was made before the German Reich, which has now been reduced to the status of a radio audience. It listens to the star turn, applauds at the right moment, and the whole thing is broadcast on an international hookup. For 2 hours, the Führer's thick, insidious voice boasted, coaxed, pleaded, threatened, but throughout was an unmistakable note of anxiety. In preparing his speeches, Hitler first of all gets long and detailed memoranda from his subordinates. With his horn-rimmed spectacles perched on his beaky nose, he goes through them carefully, writes either yes or no to the suggestions and scribbles notes of the points he wants to make on the margins. Fast shorthand typists are then called in, and orator Hitler strides up and down the room, dictating and incidentally rehearsing the overtones, vocal inflections, and the moments when he wants to bawl like a Prussian sergeant. The welter of the words is typed out on a special big key typewriters so that he can read it easily. So again, it's kind of like reading a novel, this, isn't it? And you can't help but think to yourself, how did the News Review journalists know in this level of detail how Hitler goes about putting a speech together? You know, they're not trying to be impartial, are they? For reasons that are completely understandable. You know, we're at the beginning of war, but they're not trying to be impartial. They're trying to paint a very particular picture of Hitler and what he's like. So the peace proposal then, this is how it's reported in the paper. It says the main points of the verbose mixture were as follows. So this isn't a word-for-word account of what Hitler proposed. This is this paper's kind of summary, which it describes it as a verbose mixture of stuff that's come out of Germany. So point A is a preliminary glorification of the German army in its Polish victory, coupled with an assurance to the world at large that Poland would never rise again to make trouble between Germany and Soviet Russia. Then point B, vague hints at Germany's future policy in collaboration with Soviet Russia in Eastern and Southern Eastern Europe, coupled with a sneer at those international journalists who had wickedly imagined that Germany had ambitions in the Soviet Ukraine. Now, the idea that Germany had interest in Ukraine is something that had been covered in Mein Kampf, apparently, in Hitler's own work. But it says here that that has been hastily revised now. And then point C, an invitation to Britain and France to call off the war and sit at a big peace conference for which there would have to be first demobilisation and then a preliminary period of preparation. The invitation was described as my last offer and was given the character of an ultimatum by a lurid picture of the alternative, which was a colossal and destructive war on which it was shrewdly suggested that both sides would be the losers. With regard to point A, the world was asked to take note that Germany had lost over 10,000 soldiers killed, 3,400 missing, and suffered 30,000 wounded soldiers. In the Polish campaign, these are Hitler's figures. For comfort, Germans were assured that this was 1/20th of the losses which their master had anticipated. Lacking no trick of dramatic effect, the Führer tided over this sad little story by requesting that the Reichstag to stand up while he gave out those figures. In Section B, it was hinted that there will probably be set up a Polish puppet state centred on Warsaw in complete subjection to the Reich. The transference of population meant that Poles would be ousted from the former corridor in favour of Germans and dumped in the Central Protectorate. And then with regard to Section C, which was the suggestion of a peace conference, it says the crowning item of the speech began with another list of assurances to the neighbouring states that Germany has no further claims on them. And then there's a kind of a list of comments about all the other European countries, Sweden, Norway, Scandinavia, Belgium, Switzerland, Yugoslavia, that Germany doesn't mean them any harm. It then says, finally, France was assured that the Führer had long laboured to bury the old Franco-German enmity. And then with regard to Britain, it says there was only one outstanding question state left, was Britain. Here too the Führer had hoped for understanding and believed it was essential to European peace. Then the paper says that the next day the world gave the orator a shock. From Melbourne to Washington, politicians, diplomats, editors and ordinary men and women declared that this was a peace at Hitler's price and it was not good enough. However much people wanted peace, they felt that the rosy prospects strewn in this speech had been deliberately painted by Berlin, by an artist whose colours had already and too often proved to be all varnish and vanish. It was reported that Hitler was relying on assistance from Franklin Roosevelt, At his White House press conference, the US President replied, however, that he had no statement to make. And friend Mussolini showed similar reluctance to come to the rescue. The Führer's best reception came in a mild applause from Moscow, which had never printed his speeches before and is currently doing very nicely at the orator's expense. So there we have it, October 1939, and Hitler is looking for peace, but he's very much looking for peace on his own terms, having just invaded Poland, and the world at large is telling him to get stuffed. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that, and if you did, please like and subscribe, and please have a look at my channel where I'm reviewing the newspapers from the 1930s and the 1940s. Thank you.